So let's read. Esther chapter 1. Oh, by the way, I have an introduction handout with a map on the back. So if you didn't get one last week, but you want one, stop at the end and come get it, and I'll give you one of those, okay? All right. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, and in the 3rd year of his reign he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes, and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace, for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink in his own way, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. Since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king, Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 nobles of Persia and Media who had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. According to law, what must be done to Queen Vashti, he asked. She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong not only against the king but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice, so the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language, proclaiming in each people's tongue that every man should be ruler over his own household. All right, so let's just talk about the opening bit here in verses 1 to 3. So it opens with this guy named Xerxes, or your translation might say Ahasuerus, something like that. So Xerxes is his Greek name. Ahasuerus is the Hebrew version of his name. So literally it uses Ahasuerus because it's in Hebrew. But if you look for this guy in history, you won't find Ahasuerus, you'll find Xerxes, because in Greek he's called Xerxes the First. So he's the king of Persia, and we know from historical sources he was about 32 when he became king, and he reigned for 20 years, and then he got assassinated. And he's the 4th king of the empire. He's the son of Darius, who figures into the events in Daniel and Ezra. And just so for some context, Esther takes place after Daniel, about a century after Jerusalem was sacked. So about 100 years after the time of Daniel is when Esther takes place, but before Nehemiah. So Xerxes is the father of Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes is the guy who shows up as the king in the book of Nehemiah. So Esther's just a bit before the time of Nehemiah. And Susa, or some translations say Shushan, it's just a different name for the same town. But this is the same city where Nehemiah was. And the citadel that's in Susa is the fortified core of the city. So it's just kind of a city within the city, but that's where the king lives in a place that's fortified. So it'll talk about the citadel of Susa several times. It's just the central part of the city that's fortified for the king. Okay, now, do you know anything about Xerxes? I know that's just the sort of stuff you read for fun, right? Just, He's an interesting guy, this guy. So, because there are these ancient historical sources from that time, we actually know quite a bit about him. So King Xerxes he was actually the greatest of all the Persian kings, but he was kind of his own worst enemy. So during the first part of his reign, he assembled this massive army because Darius had tried to invade Greece and he didn't get it done. And so Xerxes decided he was going to try to finish off what his dad started. So he assembled this army. It was over 1 million soldiers. It was the biggest that anybody had ever seen at that time. And he invaded Greece. And he managed to sack the city of Athens. And it looked like the Persians were going to take it all over. And then they got defeated by Greece in a naval battle. And they had to retreat. And so because the Persians were forced back when they were defeated by this small Greek force, you can imagine that the Greek poets and the playwrights have an awful lot to say about Xerxes because they beat him. So that whole campaign is called the Persian Wars. And there's a lot in Greek poetry and plays and history about the Persian Wars and about King Xerxes. So there's a historian named Herodotus who has several things to say about Xerxes. The things he wrote, we're going to come back to him several times because he has some interesting things that sort of fill in the blanks about who Xerxes was and what he was doing and why he did some of the things that he did. But Herodotus says that after he retreated and went back to Persia, then he started on this massive building campaign, built himself a new palace, did all kinds of interesting things. Herodotus also says he was an infamous womanizer. Well, if you know what comes later in the story, you already know that. But just collected women like postage stamps. I mean, he had a harem that was just hundreds and hundreds of women. And had a lot of trouble with not pursuing the wives of his brothers and his army officers. So he had a lot of conflict that had to do with women. And it's not really a surprise he got assassinated because he managed to make a lot of enemies just being who he was and indulging in whatever he wanted. Okay, so there's some background about Xerxes. Now, it starts, how does it start in verse 1?
Huge empire.
Huge
empire.
It is.
Think about India to Ethiopia.
Yes.
Long ways.
And it actually even went further than that because it says it's 127 provinces from India to Kush, which is roughly from modern-day India and Pakistan in the north to Sudan in the south, and then all the way up to Turkey in southern Europe. So that all of that area is controlled by King Xerxes. The Persian Empire is massive. And all these provinces cover loads of different people groups, and they all have their own languages. Some of them are big, lots of them are just small people groups. Some of them have been conquered by the Babylonians, who then got conquered by the Persians. And so just whichever king conquers, they just take over the region. And the Persian Empire has just gotten bigger and bigger, and it's massive. So he controls all of this area, and, well, we'll see. He has a lot of money. So what does he do in verses 2 and 3?
He throws a feast.
Yeah. A little one?
For the army of Persia and
80
India.
days, wow. That's
Yeah.
half a year.
So he gives this banquet for the nobles, the officials, the military leaders, all those people, based on the time period. But a lot of the commentators think is that this is before he invades Greece. And what he's doing is he's trying to get support for his military campaign. So he's invited all of these important people and the military leaders and everybody to come for a party because he's going to display his wealth and his power for all of these people that he wants to support him when he goes to do this invasion. So he starts off with a 6-month open house. I mean, that's just kind of what it sounds like, is that he's just doing an open house for 180 days where everybody can come and see all the splendor and glory of his majesty. He wants them to see all the impressive stuff that he has. And then when those 6 months are over, then what does he do?
What's another party?
Tell me about this party. What kinds of stuff does the author tell us about how it is?
It's not, I mean, it's everybody, the great and the small.
Yep.
7 days, but it's more intimate, and it sounds like it's just a big garden.
Yeah, and there's like the people from Susa, and then the nobles who are out there, but it's not like open to the whole country to just show up. Yeah, so, yeah. And how is it? Like a barbecue?
No, he definitely wants to show his wealth.
What kinds of things are described there that give you a sense of?
Gold goblets.
Yep.
Royal,
Yep.
not just wine, but royal wine.
Uh-huh. Yep.
And the room was beautiful with linens and.
Yep.
Hanging plants.
Yeah, marble pillars.
Marble pillars.
Yep.
Mosaic tables.
Yep. Couches of silver and gold. I was like, that doesn't sound very comfortable. Yeah.
Just for looks and not for sitting on.
But the wine wouldn't stain it, right?
So it was an overnight party, it was a
Week-long.
pajama party.
It was a week-long pajama party. Well,
Well,
what does he
the
say
couches
about
for it.
what does he say about the wine?
You can have as much as you want or as little as you want. He told that's what he, or the people serving it, is at your liberty, very libertas.
And I'm expecting there probably weren't a lot of teetotalers. Or if there were, they probably went home the first day. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is not like a Christmas festival where you just show up and you have nice food, every day for 7 days. This is a drinking party. I mean, it's a banquet where everybody is just drinking to excess. And I can't even imagine what it would have been like at the end of 7 days. It's like a stag party that never ends. I mean, it's just awful to think about how bad it would be at the end of that week when the wine just keeps flowing and everybody just drinks as much as they want.
I think I can understand why Queen Vashti didn't want it.
I can too, and we're gonna talk about that in just a minute, but I think it's completely reasonable what she does. Yeah. Now, this kind of description is really, just the description that's this lengthy and vivid about the decorations, the furnishing, the wine, that is really unusual in biblical narrative. It's so uncommon in the Old Testament that you would get descriptions of the colors and all that kind of stuff. In fact, the only other times you get this kind of description is with the tabernacle and the temple. And so if the author's including this kind of description, he wants to make an impression on us about something. What is it that you think he wants us to take away from that description?
His power and his wealth.
That's right. I mean, he is making it as clear as possible. This king has power and he has wealth beyond what you could probably imagine. I mean, he's got absolute power in this empire and he has so much money. Well, you're obviously not worried about an invasion if you throw a 6-month open house, are you? He's not worried about his enemies. He's not worried about being invaded. He's got all the power and all the money he could want.
Well, yeah, 6 months open house and everybody's drunk, so.
And you know who wrote Esther?
We don't. No.
I was wondering, was that clear of what was there? You'd almost think the person was there to see it.
I think
Yeah.
so.
That the person had to, it had to be a man that was there for the party, for it, to be able to know that level of detail.
Yep.
It's almost like you have to be firsthand.
And yeah, go ahead, Donna.
I read they thought Mordecai wrote it.
It is possible. There are some people who think Mordecai wrote it. We don't know for sure, but it wouldn't surprise me. Yeah. And the other thing, since you said that, the other thing is, did you notice how specifically he names the 7 eunuchs and the 7 advisors? Why do we need to know that? I mean, they're not major players of the story. Why do we need to know their names? Well, we don't need to know their names, but I think, again, number one, it shows it's historical because you don't give names to unimportant people in a fiction account. And number two, it shows whoever wrote it is an insider in the palace. Like, he's got the details, and this isn't the only time he's going to do this. He's got the inside scoop on what's going on in the palace, and that's important because of the things that are going to come later. There are things that he's going to tell us that most of the people in the empire have no idea about, but he knows all the little inner workings of things that are happening with the king and his advisors, and when he goes to sleep or not, and like all that kind of stuff. Whoever this guy is, he's got the inside scoop. Yeah. So his wealth and his power, that's so clear in this opening bit, that this is a guy that how could you mess with this guy? Because there's nobody wealthier than him and no one with more power than him. And do you also get the sense of how self-indulgent he and his advisors are? I mean, like when he just says, keep the wine flowing for everybody. Oh my goodness. I have no doubt that he's drinking himself silly too, and so are his advisors. So, yeah, this self-indulgence is kind of, well, what could go wrong, really? All right, so let's talk about what happens next. What happens in verses 10 to 12?
In the state of drunkenness, he
Yep.
orders that Vashti be brought out and put on his foot.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, no, thank you.
Yeah, because again, I think we're intended to read between the lines when it's, mine says he's in high spirits, but you're right, he's drunk. And all of his advisors and the men who are with him are drunk. So this is not a matter of go get the queen because we're going to have a royal procession. And, this is like a stag party where you just call out the queen to be ogled by all of the drunk men who are in the room. It's horrific what he's doing. No self-respecting woman would ever do that, and definitely not if you're the queen. It's actually completely inappropriate for him to be asking the queen to do this, to come and be the eye candy for all of his drunk guests. That's what you do to a mistress. It's not what you do to your wife, and it's not what you do to the queen. It's completely inappropriate that he does this, but he's drunk. So he just wants her to come put on her royal finery, come and be displayed in front of all of his guests. And she's like, no. Good for her. I mean, I read it and I'm like, good for her. Not only because, here's a woman who's just not going for all that degrading, humiliating stuff, but also because she's the queen. And if she does this, how much respect will there be for her on the other side of it as the queen? She can't go out in front of everybody and degrade herself like this and allow him to degrade her that way.
I had heard once, and maybe it's wrong, that it's like when he says bring her out in a royal crown, that was all he wanted.
It might possibly
It
be.
was, I want her naked with just her crown.
Yeah.
And I heard something along the lines of, too, she might have been pregnant at the time.
I've heard that too, and I don't know, but whichever way it goes, it's inappropriate what he's expecting from her. It's
But
just,
wouldn't she also know that to refuse could be a death sentence?
she's between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
I mean, it's go out and degrade yourself in front of all of these people, or tell him no when he could be like off with your head,
Yeah.
But then when she's degraded like that, he could be off with your head later.
Yeah, that's true, yeah. Yeah. So she says no, and how does he respond to that? Furious, and then, yeah, and I'm like, and just to make sure we got how furious he is, it's like he's furious and furiouser, like he's super, super angry. And so what does he do? Calls out a marriage counselor, right? Okay, tell me about the wise men. The wise men that are drunk with him, that's right.
7 dwarves.
But it does say that they were the closest to the king.
Right,
And it,
yeah,
in law and judgment, but it's like she hasn't really broken the law.
that's right.
They're more worried about what it means for them with
Mhm.
their lives.
That's right.
That's really what it comes down to. She hasn't broken the law. Instead of saying,
They're going to create a law.
Yeah. So in the empire, the king typically had 7 advisors. These are the highest noblemen in the whole kingdom. They're the only ones who can enter the presence of the king uninvited and unannounced, are these 7 men. And they were considered experts in all things political, matters of law and justice. So he speaks to these men and asks them what to do about Vashti. And I'm like, wait, just go to a marriage counselor, stop getting drunk or something. But you're right, he makes this a matter of law and justice, not a matter of a conflict between a husband and a wife, not a matter of he did something really stupid because he was drunk, but now it's a matter of law and justice. Like he wants something official done about this.
And these are his marriage counselors.
Yeah, pretty much. Why do you think he makes such a big deal of it right here? Couldn't they have just dealt with this on the side behind the scenes? Why does he have to deal with this publicly and make an example of her?
He's embarrassed.
In front of all of those guests. And why were all those guests there?
To show his might.
That's right. I mean, he's trying to get them on his side to support his military campaign. He can't look weak right here. Like, he can't let a woman defy him in front of all of these people that he's invited. He's going to lose face in front of his guests. And that's huge for him. And it's not, this husband-wife thing between the king and the queen. It's not like now. It's political. It's a political alliance. They're not in it for the companionship. It's always because it's politically expedient. And this isn't a woman he necessarily loves. She has a political purpose. And if she's making him look bad, if she's making him look weak in front of all those people, he's got to do something to save face, especially if he wants all these men to go to battle with him. So he's got to do something with her, and it has to be official and public and like with all of the noblemen on board. Now, when the advisors come back, I mean, what does Memucan say?
Not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but against everyone.
Oh my goodness. Yep. Like this is now, when I read that I thought, so no one points out how completely inappropriate it was what he just did. Nobody says maybe you should just sober up and temper your drinking habits and treat the queen with respect. Like that's what a good advisor would have said. They put this in, they portray it as an issue that sets a dangerous precedent. So the fact that the queen would refuse to obey the command of the king is an act of defiance, they say, not just against the king, but against the kingdom. This guy, Memucan, he's not worried about the king being self-indulgent or unreasonable or doing stupid things when he's drunk, which you'd think they'd be worried about because he's got so much power. But they don't seem to be worried about that. This is about the king's pride and position, and I think it's probably about the nobleman's pride and position as well, and the fact that the queen made him look bad. So Memucan focuses all the attention not on bad leadership, but on the danger of women standing up to men. Oh my goodness. So if this act of defiance goes unpunished, he says, the result will be an empire-wide rebellion by all of the women. No, it won't. But you got to make it sound good. You got to stroke his ego. That's what Memucan is doing. Is he's just putting this in terms that he knows this is what the king wants to hear. That we will deal with her in a way that will make him save face.
But isn't this, I just think this was, just mimics our culture. Because the nobles themselves, if one of them had stood up and said, let's take a deep breath and think this through. He would have been ousted.
Yeah.
But he didn't pass the trumpet in. Because that wasn't what the decision was going to be.
Yeah. So you get the sense, don't you, that these advisors are not about doing what's wise and good and right. They are about telling the king what he wants to hear, because they have their power, they have their own status, and they're going to protect themselves, and they know how to work his pride in the right way. Which, well, the dangerous thing, there's all kinds of dangerous things about that, but one of the dangerous things about that is that pride makes you easy to manipulate. Because if people know where your pride is, they know how to appeal to it in a way where they'll get you to do what they want, because they can phrase it in a way that you're like, oh yeah, that's what I want. That's what they're going to do. They're going to manipulate him. And that can't go badly, can it? What could go wrong with an advisor who can manipulate the king to do whatever he wants? Yeah, but they don't do it.
There's probably a political reason behind his advisors saying get rid of her, because they probably have a sister, or they have another person that they
Uh-huh.
want her to be queen.
Yeah.
There's probably a political reason for them to be happy to be rid of her,
Mhm.
because it can advance others that they prefer.
It's very possible, yeah. Yeah.
And I always think it's like, obviously, like you said, marriages back then were political alliances. Unfortunately for Vashti, she obviously didn't have a father in a strong enough position where it would have hurt him to hurt her father, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Punishing her, because sometimes that's what kept some of the queens safe,
Mhm.
and was knowing like, ooh, you better not, you married my daughter, but the whole reason you married her is for alliance in my house.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't, so she didn't come from strong enough.
Right. Or even like the monarchies in Europe, if you have a king from France who marries a queen from Spain, if he treats the queen badly, he ends up at war with Spain.
Right, yes.
But Vashti doesn't have that kind of thing to back her up. So he can be rid of her, it seems, without any political consequences to himself. But remember how big his empire is. I mean, how big is France and Spain, and how big is his empire? Like, he doesn't have to appease anybody,
No.
because he owns it all.
I think that some of this is really, some of the fictions that have project, it's like being queen, and I think we even get some of that in Esther, if I remember right. It's like, okay, you're queen, but you're still lonely, you're isolated, it's not like that's a wonderful position to be in. So it's like, oh my goodness, that just complicates it, if you
Yep.
queen. I think.
Well, and at some point, if the king gets tired of you,
Yeah.
well, you're stuck in the palace for the rest of your life.
It's not right, so
Yeah.
it's not like you're anything special. to
That's
you.
right.
He kind of makes a point to show how insignificant women really are to him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which is important in the story later.
Yeah.
That's right. Yep.
Be their husband, whatever.
Yep. So, this act of defiance has to be punished, or there will be no end of all the discord in the empire. Oh my goodness. Okay, so what advice do they give the king in 19 and 20?
Let him issue a decree,
Mm-hmm.
a royal decree,
Yep.
and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed,
Mm-hmm.
that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes.
Yep. Yeah, and it's not just Vashti, well, he says then, give her position to somebody who's more worthy of it. But then what's the intended result in verse 20 when everybody hears about this decree?
All women will respect their husbands.
Too late. I've already lost all respect for Xerxes, but yeah, I mean, they're not just going to deal with this in-house. They're going to spread this through the whole empire, like 127 provinces of the empire. They're going to make an issue of this, where it's like, make sure that the women know they have to stay in line. And that's exactly what the king and all the noblemen want to hear. So the king does it. He sends these dispatches to every part of the empire, every province, and in every language. So everybody knows it, to make sure all the men understand each of them should be the ruler of his own household. So don't mess with the king. Follow him to war. That's what he wants. And I think that's part of the reason why this is it's an empire-wide decree, because he's trying to get support from across the empire for what he wants to do. Well, here's just a little show of power. Not like a military campaign, but it's like you mess with the king, this is what happens, and so Vashti's out of here. Okay, now let's just talk about this chapter. I'm actually not going to try to apply a lot of it, because the application will come later, like more specifically, although you can see lots of similarities in culture and that kind of thing. But let's just talk about what stands out to you. What gets your attention? What are the things that the author wants us to take away from this before we get on to the events of chapter 2, do you think?
Well, he definitely wants to establish the character of the king,
Mm-hmm.
because then that ends up sort of being used later on
So tell me about the character of the king.
Well, he's prideful,
Mhm.
he is, well, like you said, he's a womanizer.
Mhm.
He's real concerned with his own power
Yep.
and his ability to project it,
Mhm.
and control
Yep.
what people do.
Mhm.
And he expects 100% loyalty
Yep.
immediately.
Mhm.
So, whether it's a good decision or a bad decision,
Yep.
he is almost godlike in that he doesn't think he can make a bad decision, and people, I don't know, like you said, they use his pride against him, but they also give lip service to him and treating him like a god.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Sounds like a great place to live, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the impression you're supposed to take away is this is a guy nobody can oppose. He has absolute power. He has so much wealth. Nobody can stand up to him. Nobody, including his wife. I mean, that's the thing is then you think, well, if he does something unjust, if he does something wrong, how do you ever get vindication? You don't. Because he does what he wants. And it's going to look for a while like he is fully in control. It's going to look on the surface like King Xerxes is the one in control because nobody can oppose him or stand up to him. Yep.
Makes you wonder what the rest of the women in his term are thinking. Like, whoa, if it was that easy to get rid of her, what's he gonna do with us?
Yeah. So let's all keep quiet.
Well, and I think there's even a subtle message to the men underneath him with this. If I'm sending out that I've got rid of my wife, and I'm telling you, you are, the husbands now are the head of their own household, but by the way, I'm the head of the kingdom.
Yeah.
Like, there's a subtle, like, your household is under mine.
Understand the hierarchy.
Understand the hierarchy. And
Yep.
I can get rid of my queen, I can get rid of you.
Mhm. Yeah. Yes.
But maybe somebody thought she'd be the next queen.
Sounds like, I don't know. Sounds like wanting to be the wife of Henry VIII. Like, how long are you going to last, you know? I don't know.
So what happens to Vashti? Like, does she just sort of go
Well,
into exile?
she gets banished, but I don't know where she ends up. So I don't know if she's, I assume she's sent somewhere away from Susa, but I don't know where she goes. Yeah, the power, the wealth, the self-indulgence, the ruthlessness, the pride, and the unpredictability of the king are all on display right here, and they're really important because all of that's going to figure into the story later. If you are going to oppose something the king does, how could you do it? How in the world could you come up against the king without ending up the way Vashti did? I mean, that's the other thing. Why include the story of Vashti in particular? If you want to show that the king has power and you can't mess with him, surely you could include a story about him executing one of his enemies, you know, or winning a big battle or whatever. Well, because if you know what comes later in the story, you know that it's intentional by the author to show the queen cannot mess with the king, let alone everybody else. But she cannot stand up to him. And it's not like Vashti confronted him or criticized him. She just refused to do what he said. The queen can't do that. And that's important, yeah, to what comes later.
Sally, what keeps ringing to me is like, because we know the failures of David.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, not like this, but certainly on a scale.
Mm-hmm.
But we also completely see there was God didn't have anything to do with it. Because he was so it was all self and self-will and so there is, and we're watching that in our culture.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you pierce the conscience isn't an issue
Yep.
or at play. It doesn't have a role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But maybe that also shows them the greater, we're all getting like really excited and jumping ahead and like trying to get things because we know what's going to happen. But, you know, because ultimately, like, what does happen to the king?
Yeah, another victory that they think they're thinking is not a victory at all. But God still intercedes even, and we watch that through us.
Yeah.
And I've always like respected Vashti for the there was something really cool about that. She knew she probably could get killed for this, she could do whatever, and she still opposed and did what was right. I think it's this small little part in the Bible about it.
Yeah. And the queen who comes after her is going to have to be more shrewd. She's going to have to figure out how to get the king to do what she wants. And she's going to do what the advisors have been doing. She's going to figure out a way to manipulate the king the way his advisors do. But you got to do that if you know what happened to Vashti. You know, the queen's got to be shrewd enough to stroke the king's ego to get him to do what she wants. Now, there are a couple things missing in this book. You know what they are? God. No mention of God, not just in the first chapter, but in the whole book. We're going to come back to that in just a second. The other thing that's missing in chapter 1 is the people of God. Okay, now we can know what comes later, but this is, apart from Genesis, this is the only other narrative book in the Bible where the people of God don't make an appearance in the first chapter. Where are they? Why don't they show up? Why don't they even figure into the story yet? Like the whole first chapter is just about this pagan king and his kingdom and how powerful he is.
Because they're Jewish, and they are like banned. Like they don't like Jewish people.
And they're very unimportant. Yeah. Like within the empire, they've been conquered. And they're this little minority people group. And, well, we'll see later, Mordecai even is like, don't tell them who you are. Yeah, because I don't think Jews don't have most favored nation status. And they're powerless. They're powerless and they're insignificant, which is actually a judgment on the people of Israel that fulfills the prophecies that come in 1st and 2nd Samuel. When God said, there's a place where Solomon is praying at the dedication of the temple, and God answers him and says, if you break the covenant that I have with you, this nation's going to become a byword. There's going to come a day when they're going to be taken away, their city's going to be and they're going to be completely insignificant. That's where they're at right now. They're in exile, occupied by the Persian government. They are completely unimportant. They're a byword, which I think is why they're not even going to show up until the 2nd chapter, because they have no power. How are the Jews going to stand up to Xerxes and the Persian Empire when they're this tiny little despised people group, and he has all the power and wealth that he has? So they're missing, but they'll show up in chapter 2. And God is missing, and he never gets mentioned in the whole book. Why do you think? And there are places where you have to work to not mention God in the book of Esther. It's on purpose. Why do you think the author chooses not to mention God in the whole book?
Because that's it. That's an inspired book. God's chosen not to, we don't know why.
I think because how he expresses himself, how he is seen, and his power is seen without actually having to name him, is very apparent throughout the book. That's just a guess.
Yep.
But that he is calling on our more subtleties of his character, knowing his subtleties of his character, to see how that is shown and his power is revealed without actually having to name him. Now, why that is, I still don't know. But
Well, if there's never a mention of God, at some point you start to get this feeling like he's not there. Now, we know that he's there, but I think the author is intentionally creating in the story a feeling like he's absent. Why would he want us to feel that sense, like it appears that God isn't here?
Kind of what they're, I was gonna say, it's what they're living.
That's
with,
right.
And that, I mean, it relates now, like this world now, it feels like, people can feel like God's not there, you can feel the absence. People, we have a secular society, we have a pagan world that we live in. Nation, even though it even had Christian roots and like that, we have a very pagan feeling country, a very secular world throughout. And I think it's that beauty of, even if I'm not mentioned, even if I'm not there, and it's not my king's, I'm still in control. And it doesn't have to be declared for that.
You know, and actually, my heart's in the same place, and I think, you know, the line that we all know, perhaps you were born for a time such as this, that's who we are. It's like, it's so chaotic, and yet God indwells us, Christ indwells us, and gives us that hope and that sense of responsibility. Even if I don't know exactly what I'm supposed to do with some of this, but he's at work, and there's that sense of that too. And working all things for good for those that love him. It's like when you unravel this puzzle and see what would, even with his name not being named, who else could do that? There is no one else that could do that.
When you start to feel like God isn't there, the next obvious question is, so who's in control? I'm sure there are a whole lot of Jews who feel right now like Xerxes is in control of their destiny. He controls their future because he has all the power and all the wealth. And you know how that feels, don't you? Like feeling like there are unbelievers who are in control of us, are in control of our society, and sometimes you feel like there's nothing you can do about it. And it's perfectly natural for people to say, where is God? I mean, it really looks like he's not here. But the interesting thing in Esther, if you've read ahead, is that how is it that God appears? Does he appear in a prophet? Nope. Does he appear in a spectacular miracle? Nope. Does he make the sun go out like he did in Egypt? There's nothing miraculous, at least on the surface, there's nothing that looks miraculous or spectacular, nothing that would get anybody's attention. But by the end of the book, it's going to be so clear somebody is in control, and it's not Xerxes. There's somebody else who's orchestrating things behind the scenes to bring about exactly the outcome that he wants. And it's going to be so subtle that loads of people are not even going to notice. But you get the pileup of coincidences at some point where you're like, okay, something's going on right here. Yeah, it's somebody with a capital S who's in control, who looks like he's not there, but he's got his fingers on everything. And his people need to know that. The Jews at that time need to know that, and we need to know it too. That when it looks like God isn't there, he is fully in control. And I would really like God to do something miraculous and spectacular. And so often there's a commentator who calls it mustard seed mode. He's so often working in behind the scenes ways that we don't see, but he's completely in control. It's not Xerxes who's in control. It's not the president who's in control. It's our God who's in control. And it'll be so clear by the time the story's over. All right, comments?
Did you have all of this in mind when you landed on Esther? Was it fun?
Partly. It's partly because I like the story, but it's also partly because it's really relevant.
It's so incredibly relevant.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Again, Sally.
Yep.
Not that it matters, but it's cute. I have to say, one of my favorite things is my boys love the story of Esther, which I find funny as boys who are, that one of their favorite stories is Esther, and a woman, and a woman who they realize that she's got courage, and they love, and so it's like, I really love that. Part of what I love Esther is that she's obedient, but she's very courageous. And it's a great role model for us to be courageous when everything, and to go in God's power, even when everything tells us not to, and it's scary. And in such a time as it is, when your country isn't in control, when it's not the Jews that are in control, it's not Israel that's in control, you don't have your own king, you don't have your, like you said, they're this tiny little minority group. And part of why I love that is that he uses a woman to show that strength and that courage. Yeah, I don't know.
Tell me what happened.
That's a great candle.
Yeah. And in the back back of all of this story, there are these ancient promises of God that go all the way back to the book of Exodus that are going to be relevant to things like, is God really in control? Yeah, he is, but you might not see it on the surface.
Yeah, I was reading Isaiah, and it's talking about Cyrus, and so I thought this was kind of relevant. It says that Cyrus is the Lord's anointed, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations, to loose the belt of kings, to open doors, that gates not to be closed. And then he says, for the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel my chosen, I call you by your name. I name you, though you do not know me. I am the Lord, there is no other. Beside me there is no God. I equip you, though you do not know me, that people may know from the rising of the sun, and from the west there is none beside me. So I think, like, if you read Esther, you have to take it in the context of, like, all of these other books in the Bible that just show, like, God uses people as his instruments, even if they don't know him. And so in this case, I just think that just applies. I mean, he is definitely acting, like, in a way that reflects how he acts in a lot of other cases in the Bible. So, anyway. And where does Cyrus come in relation to Esther?
Before the, it's
This is
before it.
before the
Yes.
Babylonian.
Cyrus comes after, he's the Medes and the Persians, so he comes after Nebuchadnezzar,
Okay.
but before the time of Esther.
The other thing that seems to be evident already is the place that we as women have in the New Testament because of Jesus. And I just always marvel at the place that women had in the Old Testament, which was no place. I mean, you could just have to do what your husband wanted you to do, whatever, you were just a piece of property, basically.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. It's so funny because people say, oh gosh, like it's so, like the Christian faith is so oppressive towards women, and you're like,
Just a minute.
what the heck are you talking about? I mean, look at the history. Women had no place in society, and Jesus raised up women and explained, like, God created men and women equal, with different roles, but equal, you know? And so you're like, you kind of want to laugh.
Well, and even in the
Yeah.
Old Testament, if you read, for example, through the book of Judges, one of the things that's really interesting, kind of tragically interesting, is that, well, the book of Judges is about the paganization, the Canaanization of the nation of Israel, and how they come into the promised land, and then every generation they get more and more pagan, more like their neighbors. But one of the things that's really depressing, in so much that's depressing in Judges, but one of the things that's really depressing is that as the nation becomes more pagan, the women and the children suffer. And it is the women and children who suffer first and most when they become more like the Canaanites. So at the beginning of the book of Judges, you see women who are courageous, you see women who are strong, you see women getting rights and privileges of land and inheritance, where they are treated with respect and they're listened to, and there's a woman who's a judge. And by the end of the book of Judges, they are being assaulted and murdered and kidnapped because God raises women up and the world abuses them. And yeah. Well, yeah, it's like you said, it's ironic that lots of people think Christianity is what oppresses us. No, Christianity is what gives us rights.
Yeah.
Because it affirms that we're made in the image of God. It's losing all of that then leads to oppression of women and children.
So in the Jewish culture, are the women still held with no significance? I mean,
They have significance in the Jewish culture. They don't have the kinds of rights that we had because that's just not a part of the culture that they had. I mean, it's, education and all of that kind of stuff is just totally different. So they don't have the same rights and privileges as men do. But even under the Old Testament law, women had more rights, far more rights than they did in the nations around Israel. But that's not to say that the Jewish men always abided by the law, because Jesus actually confronts the Jewish men for abusing the law when it comes to things like divorce, stuff like that, where they just kind of did what they wanted and they didn't care what happened to the women, and Jesus just wasn't about that. But yeah. All right, any last comments? If you want to add? So we started this at Set Free yesterday. and none of them have read the book of Esther. And they're like, what happens next? And I was like, this is going to be awesome. Like, you don't know what's coming. It's going to be great. Yeah.